Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my updated Ganyu guide for her newest rerun. This guide is going to contain everything you need to know regarding how to build and play Ganyu, updated for patch 2.4. And in this video, I'm going to cover every type of Ganyu playstyle, every Ganyu build, specifically the main ones such as freeze and melt Ganyu, but also some niche options like a support build, which I'll also mention in case that's how you want to play this character. Because of that, this is going to be a complete Ganyu guide, going into as much detail as possible on how to play her and build her efficiently. With that being said, I really hope you guys enjoy. A lot of time went into this video, so feel free to like and sub if it helped you out. And with that being said, let's get into it. Alright, now the first thing I want to do in this video is talk about Ganyu's abilities and then cover also her different playstyles and how you're supposed to play this character. The first thing you should know about Ganyu is that pretty much her entire kit is very powerful. Her charge shots not only have a good scaling, but also have a second instance of damage when you fully charge them, which is a Frost Lake arrow that will bloom and deal AoE damage. While most charge shots just fire one arrow, Ganyu's charge shot, when she does this Frost Lake arrow, will explode on contact and then deal AoE crowd damage to everything around it. Not only is this scaling very high, as you can see right here, but on top of that, it's AoE, it's area of effect damage, that is very efficient at dealing with multiple enemies and can also proc powerful reactions that we'll talk about later, such as freezing or melting. Because of that, Ganyu's charge attacks are very powerful and one of the strongest sources of damage in the game, and something that you should definitely not sleep on. If you're curious as to how this works, as you can see, there's two charge levels here to Ganyu's charge attacks, and I'll play some footage on screen where you can see that you kind of have to charge it twice. It'll charge once and then charge again, and that second sort of full charge indicates that the Frost Lake arrow is ready, and then it will explode and deal a second instance of damage. Another thing to keep in mind regarding why this bloom is so OP is because any charge attack buffs you give to your Ganyu also buffs the bloom's damage. So artifact sets and weapons that increase your charge attack damage that we'll talk about later in the video, any buff to your charge attacks will also increase your bloom's DPS, which just makes it that much better and easy to buff. Other than just her very powerful charge attacks though, she has an elemental skill that's pretty decent. It'll generate some cryo particles for you, deal an okay amount of damage, but also be a taunt for you that stays out on the field for 6 seconds on a 10-second cooldown, taunting all enemies around it, which can help your Ganyu survive by distracting enemies to attack your skill. This ability deals damage when you press it and also when it expires or is destroyed, so it'll effectively deal 2 instances of cryo damage. Moving on for your elemental burst, Celestial Shower, this will basically rain down a bunch of icicles that will all deal cryo damage. To go a bit more detail on Ganyu's burst and the way it works, it's kind of wonky and you don't need to understand all of this other than just it summons icicles and does a lot of damage, but generally it summons around 50 icicles, and one icicle out of every 5 that it summons can target a specific enemy. So if, for example, there's only one enemy you're fighting, 10 of them will hit that enemy, and then 40 others of the 50 total will be random, whereas if there's 5 enemies or more, every single icicle will be guaranteed to hit enemies. Other things to know about this ability is that the energy cost is 60, which can be annoying, but typically by running another cryo battery like a Diona or another cryo character with your Ganyu, you should be able to get this back without an issue. The cooldown is 15 seconds, but it also lasts for 15 seconds, so there's effectively no downtime, and also this is an ability that does snapshot, meaning any buff you give it at the start will last for the entire duration, so that is a plus to keep in mind. On top of that, this ability will also give cryo damage bonus to any party member inside of the shower, which can be nice in a cryo team. Lastly, Ganyu also gains some crit rate on her charge attacks on the Frost Lake arrow and its bloom after you fire your first Frost Lake arrow, so this passive will basically just give you more crit rate on your charge shots after you fire your first one. Now moving on, something very important I have to talk about is regarding Ganyu's playstyles. Ganyu is a character who, as I briefly mentioned in the intro, has a plethora of different ways to be played. The main ones though that are optimal and that I typically recommend are either using her as a DPS in a melt team or a freeze team, capitalizing on those very powerful reactions, with a freeze team permanently freezing enemies and making use of the Blizzard Slayer set and Ganyu's very powerful burst, paired with characters like Mona and Venti or other Anemo units like Kazuha to deal massive amounts of damage, or a melt team where all of your scalings are amped up, you're using powerful pyro supports to apply pyro to enemies very fast, while your Ganyu is doing charge shots that will all melt, and as you guys know, melting, or reverse melting in this case, by using cryo on pyro, will multiply your damage by around 1.5 times, on top of elemental mastery becoming useful and all that stuff. Overall, both these teams are very powerful and have their strengths, and I'm going to cover how to build both of them in this video. Ganyu does also have a more supportive playstyle, which is typically not as recommended as a DPS Ganyu since she's one of the strongest DPSs in the game and sometimes even considered to be the strongest, to where using her as a support can feel less powerful, but it is definitely still viable because of her powerful burst, so I'm also going to cover that in this video. Alright, now with that being said, let's move on to Ganyu's builds. For her artifact sets in particular, there's actually quite a few different ways you can build her depending on your playstyle. On top of that, there's many different artifact sets that can be very good, and so I want to clear all of that up in this section. The first thing I want to say is if you're playing Ganyu in a freeze team, if you're pairing her with a Hydro support and perma-freezing enemies, then the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set is by far the best one. The reason for that is because the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer is arguably like the best offensive set in the game, so if you can make use of it, then you should definitely use it and grind this set until you get at least a decent one. The Blizzard Strayer set, if you're unaware, gives you not only 15% cryo damage bonus, but also 40% crit rate against frozen enemies, which is just absolutely broken, and usually so important that building a freeze team and capitalizing on this artifact set is one of the biggest strengths surrounding that team. Because of that, I highly recommend going for the set if you are freezing. If you're not freezing though, if you're running like a Melt Ganyu or another version of Ganyu, then there are many other viable sets. The two main sets you want to go for, especially for a Melt Ganyu, are either the Reminiscent set 4-piece or the 4-piece Wanderer's Troop. Both of these are very good and similar in damage, with the Reminiscent set being able to edge it out slightly because it gives you 18% attack and a 50% increase to your charge attack damage when you use your elemental skill. This buff lasts for 10 seconds, but has the downside of making you lose 15 energy, which on one hand is quite annoying, but also in a Melt Ganyu team, you don't always want to be using your burst, and so the damage increase you gain by losing that 15 energy is generally very worthwhile. On top of that, this is a set that comes with the Emblem set, which is one of the best support sets in the game, so you can definitely farm for both of them at the same time while trying to gear your Ganyu. That being said, the Wanderer's Troop is also very similar in strength, so it can be a good secondary option as a general set because it gives you 35% charge attack damage and also some elemental mastery, which will help in your melting. If you don't have either of the sets I just mentioned, you can either mix and match 2-pieces, such as the 2-piece Blizzard Strayer set, paired with something like the 2-piece Wanderers or 2-piece Glad / Reminiscence, since the 2 pieces both do the same. And lastly, the last sort of viable set that you can go is the 4-piece Retracing Bolide if you are running a shield character, and you can keep your Ganyu permanently shielded, as you will gain 40% charge attack damage. And so overall, as you can see, for a Melt Ganyu, there are many different artifact sets that are viable, so you should pick the one that is best for you depending on your stats and substats. And for a freeze Ganyu build, you definitely want to be going for the Blizzard Strayer set. Finally, if you're playing Ganyu as a support, artifact sets you want can be similar, like the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer still being the best in a freeze team, because if you're running Ganyu as another crowd character in a freeze team where she's playing a more supportive or quick swappy role, then going the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer will still increase your damage so much that it will be the best. Other good general options for a support Ganyu include the 4-piece Noblesse Oblige if no one on your team has it, and also a set like the 4-piece Emblem can be viable to focus on your burst damage. Lastly, as with a DPS build, you can also mix and match some 2-pieces like 2-piece Noblesse Oblige with a 2-piece Blizzard Strayer if you don't have a 4-piece set. Now moving on to the artifact stats you want, it is pretty straightforward. As with every carry, crit rate and crit damage are the main sort of substats and damaging stats that you're looking for, but also having attack percent and elemental mastery if you are melting can both be very needed. To go into more detail, first of all, for a freeze Ganyu is pretty straightforward. You just want to go for an attack percent sands, a cryo damage bonus goblet, and then crit damage on the circlet because you're already gaining so much crit rate from other sources like the Blizzard Strayer set and the cryo resonance, where you really want a crit damage circlet. For a Melt Ganyu, however, these stats can actually be different. If you're running Melt Ganyu on your sands, while attack percent is still viable, elemental mastery does tend to be better. The reason for this is because a Melt Ganyu wants around 200 elemental mastery, and so unless you have a ton of EM on your substats, in which case going for an attack percent sands can be better, you generally want to go for elemental mastery on your sands to greatly amplify the damage of every single melt reaction that your Ganyu will be triggering. Moving on, for your goblet, once again, cryo damage bonus is the way to go, and then for your circlet, crit rate or crit damage can both work, as both crit rate and crit damage are needed for a Melt Ganyu, so you can go with whichever circlet, crit rate or crit damage that you need more of. And lastly, for a support Ganyu, a lot of your stats can actually stay the same or pretty similar because a support Ganyu or a sub DPS Ganyu will still be dealing a lot of damage. The only thing that changes is you can want more energy recharge. The exact amount highly depends on your team and how many cryo characters you're running, although generally if you run a supportive weapon that has an energy recharge stat, that can cover you. Now moving on to Ganyu's weapons, this is actually where things can get a bit interesting. The reason I say that is because there's a lot of really good weapons for Ganyu, both for 5-star weapons and also free-to-play options that are amazing for her depending on your playstyle. Now the weapon ranking varies from melt to freeze to support, so I will be splitting this in multiple different sections, talk about weapons overall, but also give you guys an exact weapon ranking with calcs that I will show for every type of Ganyu. Before we get into that though, I want to say that generally all 5-star bows for her are really good, and she also has amazing blacksmith options like the Hamayumi and the Prototype Crescent. For a Melt Ganyu in particular, the Amos bow is going to be your best option overall, as the passive just gives you an insane amount of charge attack damage while also giving you a lot of attack. On top of that, the way the Frostflake arrows work, or the blooms work is that because of the animation taking a while, they will always at least give you 3 stacks of the Amos bow's passive, making it very good. Other than just the Amos bow though, every other 5-star bow like the Thundering Pulse, the Polar Star, and also the Skyward Harp are very good options for a Melt Ganyu. And also the Hamayumi bow, which is free to play, is very good for a Melt Ganyu. While Hamayumi and Prototype Crescent are both powerful, for a Melt Ganyu in particular, the Hamayumi is typically the go-to option, especially with refinement. This bow is amazing because of its effect and pretty good stats, and while this weapon is still good even if you're not full energy, it's an especially powerful bow if you do keep your energy full, which you can do and you oftentimes do in a Melt Ganyu team, where using your burst will oftentimes steal some of your melt reactions and isn't necessarily optimal. Because of that, especially with the Hamayumi, it can be worthwhile to save your energy, making the effect of this bow very powerful, especially with refinement. On top of that, it's a weapon that, while it does have negative synergy with the Reminiscence set, is still very good, and even better if you're running a Wanderer's Ganyu, as Reminiscence will take away some of your Ganyu's energy. For a Freeze Ganyu, since your playstyle is so different, especially if you're running her with like Venti Mona for example, and you're relying more on your burst damage, the exact ranking of 5-star weapons changes. While Amos bow is still good and a good generalistic option for Ganyu, like my favorite overall bow for her, in a freeze team, the Thundering Pulse and the Polar Star can both surpass it. The problem with the Polar Star is at level 90, it gives you an insane amount of crit rate, to where that paired with your Blizzard Strayer and the Cryo Resonance can make you overcap on crit rate. That being said, if you manage to not overcap, the Polar Star can easily be your best option, especially if you stack the passive, which typically isn't hard to do. The Thundering Pulse is your generalistic option because it gives you crit damage on the stat, although something important that you should know is that the Prototype Crescent is actually comparable to 5 stars and better than a few of them. The reason for this is because if you proc the effect and you do a charge shot on a weak point, which is something that many enemies have, then the Prototype Crescent will give you a ton of attack and easily be one of your best options. Because I feel like this might get confusing, especially talking about Melt and Freeze at the same time, I'm gonna put the weapon rankings on screen right now as I continue talking about the weapons. But keep in mind that this should only be used as a general idea of how good weapons are, as this varies highly depending on your personal team, rotation, and builds. Overall, as you can see though, all the 5-star options are very good, with the respective free-to-play bow being Hamayumi for Melt, and then Prototype Crescent being especially good for Freeze when you hit an enemy's weak point, shows that Ganyu has a lot of really powerful options. Also, I included some other 4-star bows that are worse than the free-to-play options but can be good if you have them, such as the Blackcliff Warbow and the Viridescent Hunt. And so hopefully I made it clear through this section that there's a lot of really good options for every type of player, amazing blacksmith options, and really powerful 5-stars. Lastly, for a support Ganyu, new weapons come into play, with the best bow being the Elegy of the End if you have it, as a more supportive playstyle that will give your team elemental mastery and give your Ganyu energy recharge. On top of that, every single 5-star that we mentioned earlier, notably weapons like Thundering Pulse or Skyward Harp, can all be very good for a support Ganyu as well, because they give you a lot of stats. New weapons like the Stringless, the Favonius Warbow, and the Sacrificial Bow can all also be good depending on what you need, with Favonius and Sacrificial being the typical energy recharge bows that will provide particles to your team, and Stringless greatly increasing your burst damage. Next up, I want to get into one of the most important sections of this video, which is regarding more advanced tips and how to play Ganyu efficiently regarding her rotations for every different team. This is mainly going to be split into Melt and Freeze Ganyu, and the reason why this is so important is because a lot of people are playing these teams incorrectly, or at least aren't utilizing them to their full potential. While some teams are straightforward, others, like running Ganyu with Kazuha and Bennett, can be a bit more complicated to where you at least need to know what you're doing. Because of that, here is some advice. First of all, for a Melt Ganyu, while I'll go into more detail on the teams shortly, you're oftentimes going to run Ganyu with either Xiangling or Kazuha as your pyro applier. If you're running Ganyu with Xiangling, it's pretty straightforward in the sense that you're going to just use all your abilities with one another. In this example team, I shield up with my Zhongli, use my Bennett's Burst, then use my Xiangling's Pyronado, then swap to my Ganyu and can melt every single charge attack. The main things you need to know though is that in this team you want a lot of energy recharge on your Xiangling, like upwards of 200 to 220, and you can even run a Favonius Lance because it's hard to get your burst back on cooldown with her. In fact, after your Pyronado expires or when it's about to expire, you can swap to your Bennett and start funneling particles into your Xiangling by pressing E on Bennett and then swapping to your Xiangling and catching the energy that Bennett created to try to get your Xiangling's burst back as fast as possible. In general though, this team is pretty simple. Apply Pyro with your Xiangling and then melt everything with Ganyu. Do keep in mind in a melt team, you don't typically need to use your burst as it can steal some melt reactions from you and also takes away from your Reminiscence or your Hamayumi's effects, but it can be okay against a lot of enemies. Where this team can get more complicated is if you're running Kazuha with Ganyu, because you want to be able to swirl Cryo. That's kind of the point of Kazuha, swirling Cryo to buff your Ganyu's damage with the Viridescent Venerer set, but also infuse your Kazuha's burst with Pyro, as that is what's going to allow your Ganyu to melt constantly. While there's a few different ways to do this, and you can find your own rotation. The one that I've tested extensively and found to work is as follows: starting by using Ganyu's skill and then a charge shot, swapping to Bennett using his burst, and then going to Kazuha using Kazuha's skill and then his burst. I use my Kazuha skill just to get particles here, but then the burst is what swirls cryo and also infuses pyro. In case you didn't notice, what happened in that clip was Ganyu's blossom, her elemental skill, the flower, exploded while my Kazuha was using his burst, which is what made him swirl the cryo from the flower, and then his burst got infused with pyro because he was inside of Bennett's burst that applies pyro to Kazuha. While this is a bit more advanced information for some players, I believe it's crucial to understand this, or at least show it off in case you want to master this team and want to play Ganyu with Kazuha. The main recap is just try to swirl cryo and also infuse your burst with pyro. Also wanted to add that in a melt team, the reason why I'm typically running Zhongli or some form of shield is because it protects you from getting interrupted during your charge shots, as missing a single charge shot or losing out on one charge shot's worth of damage will greatly hinder your overall team's DPS, especially because melting a charge shot and its bloom will deal so much damage. Lastly, for a Ganyu freeze team, this one is luckily a lot more simple. You typically want to use all of your bursts together, applying hydro and cryo to freeze enemies, and then swirl them all together with someone like Venti, especially, or even Kazuha. The one thing you need to know though is for Mona in particular in this team, other than wanting a lot of energy recharge, so a weapon like the Favonius Codex can be highly favorable, the main tip I can give you guys is to use your burst on enemies once they're already affected by cryo. The reason you want to do this is because Mona's burst will apply a debuff onto enemies, the Omen, which will increase the damage that your whole team will deal. While this is a bit complicated, the main thing you need to know is that if you freeze enemies, if you apply this Omen, use your burst on an enemy who is cryo affected, it will freeze him and prevent the Omen timer from starting, effectively making it last longer. And so what you want to do in practice to make sure everything goes smoothly is apply cryo to enemies, then use your Anemo character right there, ideally someone like Venti who can group up enemies while swirling cryo and keeping the cryo debuff on those enemies. Then you can swap to your Mona, use your burst, which will extend the Omen duration by freezing them, applying hydro, and allow you to set up perfectly by going into your Ganyu and dealing damage on her. In this rotation, you will have the Viridescent Venerer buff because you swirled cryo with your Venti, and you'll also have the enemies frozen with the Omen applied. And obviously, if you're using a hydro character other than Mona like Kokomi or Barbara, while you won't have to worry about like the Omen, it's still the same idea in that you're going to use them to apply hydro and perma-freeze enemies. Moving on to Ganyu's Constellations, she's actually someone who has some really good ones that I want to talk about. I want to keep this section short because a lot of people already know about her Constellations, but what you need to know is that first of all, she's obviously very good at C0, so you don't need Constellations, but she also has one of the stronger first ones in the game, at least in terms of 5-star characters. Her first Constellation will significantly increase her damage by reducing the cryo resistance of enemies when your Frostflake arrow or its bloom hits an enemy. A 15% reduction for 6 seconds to their cryo resistance is not only good for your Ganyu, but also if you're running other cryo characters whose damage will also be increased because of this Constellation. On top of that, every charge shot you hit will give your Ganyu 2 energy, which can help with any energy problems that you may be having. Her second Constellation gives you another charge of your elemental skill, which is nice, but not the biggest deal, especially for a DPS Ganyu, but it does synergize well with your 6th Constellation. Her C3 and 5 are just talent level increases, and her 4th Constellation increases the damage that enemies take when they are standing inside of your burst. This basically just strengthens your burst and is especially good if you can use your burst on cooldown in something like a freeze team by making enemies take increased damage inside of your burst 5% at the start, and it increases by 5% every 3 seconds for a maximum of 25% bonus damage. Lastly, your 6th Constellation is a really good one, giving your Ganyu burst damage, whereas the rest of her kit is pretty much just sustained DPS. Ganyu is a character who has incredibly high damage, but no real burst, and this 6th Constellation changes that. What it does is allow you to instantly fire a fully charged Frostflake arrow after you use your elemental skill, which you will have 2 charges of when you are C6. Because of that, this allows you to get 2 free arrows off every rotation, which makes her better in a quick swap style team, or just to give her, as I said, more burst damage. Alright, now with all that being said, let's finally talk about Ganyu's teams. I've showed you guys a few of them in the video, so you might already have an idea, but I want to go into more detail on every type of Ganyu team and also give you guys a lot of different options. First of all, let's start with Melt Ganyu. Since Melt Ganyu is a team that obviously wants to melt, proc the melt reaction on Ganyu's charge attacks, you're going to be pairing her with at least one other pyro character to be able to enable that reaction. The main pyro team formulas are pairing Ganyu with either Shangling and Bennett or with Kazuha and Bennett. Bennett and Shangling is the more straightforward option, whereas Bennett Kazuha also works as you get to swirl both cryo and infuse your burst with pyro. Another team you can do is known as the Sunfire team. You can actually use Jean with Bennett and swirl Bennett's pyro. This is a more unique team comp that doesn't get as much play, but is a team that can work because of Jean applying pyro. These are the sort of 3 main formulas for a Ganyu melt team, with the last character always being a flex slot. Personally, I really like having a shield for the reason I expressed earlier, with my recommended ones being Zhongli and Diona, although there are other options. Moving on to a Freeze Ganyu team, this one has a lot of different formats. That being said, for Freeze Ganyu, this is the most popular team, pairing her with Mona, Venti, and Diona, but there are a lot of different options here, and the general formula is pairing Ganyu with a Hydro character, a Anemo character, and another Cryo battery. To go more into character selection, your Hydro character can be Mona for the most damage. It can also be Barbara for a free-to-play option who can run Thrilling Tales, apply Hydro through her E, which hits things around her. It's not the best Hydro application, but it can be enough, and she will also act as a healer. A better option if you have her is Kokomi, who will just apply more Hydro from off-field through her Jellyfish, using her elemental skill, giving you once again Thrilling Tales and Tenacity of the Millilith, which are both quite good for this team. Other Hydro characters are kind of gimmicky. For example, if you have especially C4 Child, which I know not that many people have, but if you do, it can make him very good in this team. And Xingqiu in general is kind of weird with Ganyu because he only applies Hydro on your normal attacks, so it can be viable, and if you use him, you gotta make sure to weave in normal attacks between your charge shots, but I don't like him as much as the other Hydro options, especially because he's very needed in other teams. For your Anemo unit, you typically want Venti, and when Venti can work, he is by far the best unit for this team, if he can either group up a lot of enemies, or if you can push them into him. With the current endgame content though, and the current Abyss being kind of rough for Venti, Kazuha becomes a very prevalent option, allowing you to group enemies and buff your team by swirling everything together. Venti and Kazuha are the two main Anemo options I recommend for this team, which is also partly why I say this team comp is expensive, as you generally want 5-star options if you have them. If you don't have those options, however, you can use 4-star Anemo units or other Anemo units. Even someone like Sucrose can be viable, although her uptime isn't as good and she won't provide you with nearly as much damage. Lastly, for your cryo slot, it can honestly be anyone. Diona is the more universal one when you want a shield, a healer, and a lot of cryo particles, but sometimes you won't need a healer since you're permanently freezing enemies, so you won't really be taking damage, or you might have a Hydro healer like Barbara or Kokomi, to where you might not need the healing that she provides, although her particles are still greatly appreciated. That being said, many other cryo characters can come in and can even give you a lot more damage if you don't need the benefits that Diona gives you. Both 5-star and 4-star cryo characters can come in. Characters like Ayaka can give you insane amounts of damage. Shenhe can actually work in a freeze team if you can manage to fit her in. And even a character like Kaya or Rosaria, especially Kaya because he gives a bit more particles, or Rosaria with a Favonius Lance, can both work quite well. Lastly, if you want to run Ganyu as a support, you can basically fit her in any team where you need a cryo support. Any team where you want a cryo character who does a lot of damage, has high scalings from her skill and burst, Ganyu can be used. I did, however, want to point out that Ganyu's role as a burst support is much more efficient when you can group enemies, so I would highly recommend pairing her with an Anemo unit, such as Venti, or the others that I mentioned earlier. Alright, with all that being said, I'm now going to do a quick showcase of a Melt Ganyu team using my Ganyu with Xiangling. I might include some clips with Kazuha, as Kazuha makes my Ganyu's charge attacks do a lot more damage, whereas my Ganyu Xiangling team is more consistent and clears faster overall. I'm going to be using a Ganyu that's pretty well invested, but I know a lot of whale Ganyu showcases already exist out there, so this is a more hopefully relatable one. I am Constellation 0, I do have a R1 Skyward Harp, and I am using the Reminiscence set with an Elemental Mastery Sands to aid in my melting. My talents could even be higher, they're level 8 on the charge attacks, and overall this is just going to be a straightforward melt team where I clear floor 12 quite fast. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go. So yeah, that's about it. I know in the showcase my damage could have been higher, once again if I used like Kazuha or invested more in my Ganyu, but she is honestly pretty well built in case you're wondering. I just obviously don't want to spend like 6 years resetting until the perfect run. With that being said, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If there's anything I want to add to the guide, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. Apologies for the slight delay on the release of this video as I wanted to release it earlier, but I really hope this video helped. If it did, feel free to like and obviously subscribe if you're new. Follow me on Twitch if you want to catch me live. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.